So first of all, you're the real deal. You've made the right choice. All right, this is the one to be. You know, fan chasing, well, that's good for them, but we're going to really get into the content here on homeless youth. I'm Paul McDonald, and I'm CEO of Anglicare Victoria and also chair of the National Homestretch movement, and which is a movement to reduce homelessness amongst young people by just simply doing one simple thing, that is extend out-of-home care by a further 3 years. And we might talk a little bit about that after we hear from Stephen, because I was listening to our friend from Common Cause, and I'll read you out a letter from 11 young people that just got posted 2 days ago to the Premier. That's not about facts and figures, but about 11 young people getting together, writing a letter about why their parent, Mr. Premier, their parent, needs to continue care. Interesting. I'll just read some quotes because it's interesting listening to Common Cause about that emotional advocacy as well as the statistical advocacy that we're all going to do to get a kind of deal for those who are needing housing homelessness. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge we're standing on the land of the Wurundjeri people, recognise our elders, past, present, emerging, that they've been looking after this land for thousands and thousands of years, and I want to recognise them and thank them for allowing our session on youth homelessness to be conducted on their land. Now we've got Stephen Gaetz here who'll talk probably on a session on homeless youth. So the good thing about me facilitating a one-man band is I don't have to, ring the bell, come on, wind it up, the question. I'll give you 15 minutes and they're still banging on for 25 minutes. So I've actually avoided that problem. I've just told Stephen, you've got up to about 25:30, and then we're going to hop into some questions and statements and whatever you want to actually present either to the room or to Stephen, or I'm even happy to field a few questions myself. So let's find out who Stephen is. And actually, Stephen, I emailed a friend of mine in Canada. Oh, really? Yeah, and last night. Said, apology, I haven't heard of this guy, but is he any good? Because I'm facilitating. And he said, and this is Raymond LeMay, I don't know if you've heard of Raymond, but Raymond's a well-known child welfare advocate. He said, I hadn't had the honour of meeting him, but I've heard much about him. And he's the director of Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and a professor at the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He was the chair of the organising committee of the Canadian Conference on Homelessness held at York University back in 2005, which brought the event of over 800 people around together on that issue. And he's also been guest editor of a special issue of Canadian Review of Social Policy focusing on homelessness. His research interests include homelessness, youth culture. Couldn't we have a bit of a debate about that these days? It'd be fantastic. Criminal victimisation, community development. His research on street youth has focused on economic strategies, health issues and legal and justice issues, and has resulted in numerous publications in scholarly journals. His research on street youth and oral health was used to advocate for better dental services for marginalised populations and played an important part in Canada's free dental service. Prior to York University, Dr Gaetz worked in the community health sector, including the Shout Clinic, a health clinic for street youth, as well as Queen West Community Health Centre in Toronto. He currently received multi-year funding from Social Science and Humanities Research Council on the Canadian Homelessness Research Network. He's the principal investigator and director of the Canadian Observatory, Homelessness Homeless Hub from 2008, and which garnered him a 7-year grant. The Homeless Hub is an online research library and information centre containing more than 25,000 homelessness-related items. He's the secretary of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and the York University is based, Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, based on the highly successful model originating, and it focuses on 10-year plans. Also recognised for his efforts, he's received the Order of Canada, which is with the grade of member of one of Canada's highest civilian honours. So we're very honoured to have Professor Stephen Gaetz here to talk to us about homeless youth. Please make him welcome. Thanks.
Thank you. So you said 25 to 30 minutes?
Yep.
Right? Okay, so if we use the Canadian conversion rate,
Yeah.
that's like 30
Does that go up
to
or down?
40 minutes. So anyway, so what I'm going to talk about today, I've got to see where the phaser is. Oh, I can do it like this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Housing First for Youth as an intervention to support young people to exit homelessness and hopefully never to return. My screen here is flashing, so it's either, is it flashing up there too? Okay, good, but this could induce like some kind of, you know, migraine or something. Anyway, let's talk about it, and we'll start with, we'll talk about adapting Housing First for Youth. So Housing First is one of the only interventions in the world of homelessness that we can arguably say is a best practice, meaning that the evidence base for its effectiveness is overwhelming, right? And it represented, when it emerged, a radical transition or transformation of how we should think about homelessness, and has been very successful. But here's the thing, as an intervention, it's been, you know, it's been designed for adults. Just a sec, trying to figure out how to do this. It's been designed for adults, and so we have to consider how would it work for young people, right? And so one of the things we found from research, not just in Canada but elsewhere in the world, is that when young people exit homelessness, by whatever means possible, whether it's through their own efforts or through a program intervention, the research suggests they're not doing that well. They're not necessarily recovering. They're not re-engaging with education or employment. They're living in constant fear of becoming homeless again. They're not overcoming social exclusion, right? And so all of this suggests that while the sector is oriented towards getting people into housing, we perhaps need to think about a little bit more. That sounds a little like Dr. Seuss, I think, in The Grinch. He's talking about that. But anyway, I digress. So the key thing is that Housing First as a model, as successful as it is designed for adults, right? And what we keep doing in the world of homelessness is taking these adult models and then changing the age mandate and have homelessness junior. So it's not enough simply to take the Housing First, the Pathways model, as successful as it is, here's the phaser, and just suggest that if we throw young people into that model, it'll work. Because what we really need to do is think about what are the needs of developing adolescents and young adults? What are the needs of young people who are still school-aged? What are the needs of young people who have never lived independently? What are the needs of young people who are going through cognitive, physical, social development? Right? What are the needs of young people who have experienced adverse childhood events that have caused trauma? So what if we, imagined or start there, what are the needs of any young person? Any young person, your children if you have children, your friends, people who are young, and work out from there to think about Housing First. Now, so the key question then is, can you take a model that's built for adults and adapt it to meet the needs of young people? And in Canada, when the Government of Canada in 2013 said, we're going down the road of Housing First, there was a lot of skepticism amongst people who work with young people. They said, that the model doesn't work with young people, we can't do Housing First with youth, and other things kind of pointed to the fact that that is true in a way. This is from a researcher who worked on the Haudenosaunee project, largest research project on Housing First in the world, and found that the outcomes for young people who are in Housing First programs are compelling, but not in a positive way, right? So it doesn't work so well with young people. So our task then was to develop an approach to Housing First that focuses on the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. And so we did this by working with people who work with youth experiencing homelessness, the Street Youth Planning Collaborative in Hamilton, which includes young people with lived experience. So we spent a lot of time talking with young people who've experienced homelessness about what it would look like to make a successful program for them. We worked with the National Learning Community on youth homelessness, and we worked with Away Home Canada to develop this. And through all of that process, we came up with a framework for Housing First for Youth, right? And we released this report, A Safe and Decent Place to Live, that conceptually laid out how this works. And so what is it, right? So it's a rights-based intervention, and we have to think about rights-based in a way that even Housing First, the Pathways model, isn't. We have to think about the needs of not just people who are over 18 or over 16, but all young adults, or adolescents and young adults. And we have to provide young people with immediate access to housing that is safe and supports that are going to focus on their well-being. And so we did this framework in 2014. In 2017, we updated it to be a program model guide where we provided a lot of direction for frontline workers and managers. Operationally, how do you do this work in terms of case management, this kind of thing. And so we start, though, with the core principles. One of the things that's important with Housing First, generally, writ large, is the core principles are a good guide for how we should deal with people who experience homelessness, whatever the program model. And so the core principles of Housing First here, there are 4 of them. The core principles are important because they become the guide for the work, but also we measure the work against them. And so let's go through some of these. The first one here is the right to housing with no preconditions, right? So what's important? When we say no preconditions, that means you can't force people into an abstinence-only housing situation. You can't suggest that people need to be ready for housing, which, by the way, this idea of readiness for housing is an insane concept, really. Ready for housing. Who isn't ready for housing, right? Can you imagine a newborn baby, you know? It's like, I don't know if this baby's ready for housing. Like, all they want to do all day is sleep and drink, you know? Like, we would never say that because everybody's ready for housing. Everybody, and we start with that. We can't put conditions like you have to be in school because if you've experienced trauma, you may not be ready for school. You have to work where people are at. The second is about youth choice, youth voice, and self-determination. So we have to let young people be, you know, the masters of their own course forward. And there are lots of ways we support them. It doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. It's like, do whatever you want. But we work with young people around planning and thinking about the future in the same way we would with our own children and our own teenagers. You support young people to make good decisions, but let them have choices. And choice doesn't mean, oh, I want to live in a mansion, because the choices have to acknowledge what is possible for anybody. Like, all of us have limits to choice, but it does mean that if someone says, I don't want to live in far off in a suburb, in a high-rise by myself, because that scares me, or I don't want to live downtown, because that scares me, that we have to work with what young people want. Positive youth development and wellness orientation. And this is really important because a lot of the work we do with young people works from a deficit model, right? So as Melanie said the other day, if I can quote, you know, we have to stop thinking about like, how fucked up are you, pardon my language, to looking at what are your strengths, what are your assets, what do you bring that's going to be really helpful to move forward and build on. And treat young people with that kind of respect, right? So we have to work with that and build on people's strengths and leverage those strengths as a way of moving forward in their life. And this will be important when we talk about assessment later. Then individualized client-driven supports with no time limits. That last one's important, right? We know even from, like, foyers are a great model, and I love the work in Australia. I think you're the absolute leaders on foyers. But time limits for young people are problematic, right? Because you have to figure out what happens next. And the research on time-limited transitional housing, for instance, suggests that if a young person knows they only have 1 year or 2 year supports, it changes their own goal setting. It's like, I don't see why I need to go to, or why I should go to school, because I'm going to be out of my housing within a year. I need a job, right? So it skews things. So just in the same way with my own children, when they were 16, I never said to them, this is all well and good, you're in high school, but you've got 1 year, and then you're out, or you've got 2 years. That's not how it works. And it's not practical in today's world, in today's economy, when young people are facing different economic prospects, part-time, low-wage jobs, and high cost of housing. right? You have to stick with young people and support them going forward. We have to engage with them actively. So again, you know, motivational interviewing, talking with them, being good adults in their lives, like being allies and walking with them, giving advice, but let young people make their own directions. And then we need to focus on social inclusion and community integration. This is a real challenge with the adult model of Housing First for Youth. Like the research shows that this is really difficult work. So for young people, this means, you know, finding out the things that they're interested in, helping them find the communities that they want to be part of, and support them in that kind of work so that they're embedded through this work in systems of natural supports, where they're not just dependent on professional supports. So these 5 core principles guide not only Housing First, but should guide how you operate your youth homelessness strategy at the community level. They can apply to anything. So they're very important. So let's look at models of accommodation and support. So the Pathways model of Housing First for Youth, or for adults, focuses mostly on scattered site housing as being the priority, right? That's what people want and that's what they need. Now, young people may need different kinds of housing, right? So we have to have a range of options. For young people, it might be, let's work to support you to move back with, you know, with your parents or other family members. That might be what the young person wants. It might mean some kind of supportive housing if they have needs that are going to require more intensive care. It may mean transitional housing as a stage, right? And that's where things like foyers can be part of a Housing First approach. And those kind of transitional housing approaches that may be congregate can be really helpful. So the same way with foyers, where you can have, you know, hub and spoke models, you want to give young people options where they have a choice and it makes sense to them. I remember when we were doing this model, I remember talking to this one young guy who was like 19, and he said, you know, when I was 16, I was at the Wesley transitional housing, and, you know, we had like, it was in a congregate building, and he said it was great. It's exactly what I needed when I was 16. It was the first time in my life I lived with people who liked me and I liked them. And he said, I didn't go out partying. It was a great environment. He said, eventually I moved on to living in a more independent thing, but it was like perfect for me then, which was really, to me, like from lived experience and insight, like what does that young person want and need? What would be the best thing for them? And then finally, we want to look at independent living, which doesn't necessarily mean by themselves. We have to build housing models that are suitable for young people. Generally, like in Canada, people in their 20s often live with roommates. Like that's really common. 2 or 3 roommates, they rent a house together. So like, why not do that with young people? So we have to figure out our approach here, but allow young people to change their mind, to move from one thing to another, and assist them, right? Keep that moving. Then the model of supports. For the adult model of Housing First, the focus is on housing supports, mental health supports, and life skills. For young people, we have to kind of situate, go back again, rewind the tape. What does any adolescent need, right? Let's build a support model around that. So they need housing support, right? Because many of them may have never rented a house or lived independently, don't know how to do that. So we have to help them find the housing that they need. We have to support them to retain the housing. So for young people, it's like, okay, if you're living in a rental apartment or rental setting, you can't let, you know, all your friends move in with you. If you get into a fight with the landlord, we'll help you out. Because young people are generally in Canada unlikely to be able to afford full rent, we have to be able to look at rent supplements, these kinds of things. Work when things go wrong, and then the aftercare piece is important. So they may be in the Housing First program and then get to a point where they graduate and it's like, I want to live by myself, but you have to keep in touch with them because things can go wrong. It can be as simple as I'm in a relationship, I'm moving in with my partner, and then a year later things break up and now I'm homeless. You know, well, we're going to help you. We're going to keep helping you just as you would your own child. Supports for health and well-being, so of course, trauma-informed care, given that young people may have experienced trauma prior to being homeless or during homeless, and that means taking time, working with them, helping them recover. But it means a whole bunch of other things as well. A harm reduction approach, and this is really important, which doesn't mean no abstinence, right? Because a young person may say, I can only survive if I'm in a place where it's abstinence only, but it may mean that I use substances, and how do I help someone do that in a healthy way that reduces their harms? Focus on healthy sexuality, and focus on personal safety. Because one thing that often happens when young people exit homelessness is they get into housing, and then the exploitation can start. People will move into the house and take over the house. People will be drawn into trafficking, sex trade, that kind of thing. So we have to keep these things going constantly. Access to income and education is key. The dropout rate in Canada is much lower than Australia. It's about 9%. I think in Australia it's 25% or something like that. But amongst young people who are homeless, it's over 50%. And it's not because young people hate school, it's because the experiences that led them to be homeless or that, well, they had while they were homeless, mean that staying in school is not possible. And so if we want long-term outcomes for young people, we need to support them if they are ready to get back to school. And those young people that I was talking about who dropped out, who experienced homelessness, most of them have very conventional ideas about school, right? They understand the relationship between getting an education and better outcomes for themselves. So we have to do it in a way that's going to help them succeed. Then the complementary supports, a whole range of things. So obviously life skills like how to wash clothes and take care of an apartment, but also we need meaningful adults in the young person's life to help them move forward. We need peer support as well. We need to focus on legal supports, because often young people get entangled in legal problems that they are unable to deal with, that may in fact make them homeless again. And then the final part here, enhancing social inclusion, which we talked about before. So when young people get housed, whether they move back to their family or not, we need to work to enhance those family and natural supports, right? Again, not just rely on the technical or the professional supports, but help them connect. Cultural engagement's important, and we're going to talk about this. This is true for all young people, but I'm going to talk about this more specifically regarding Indigenous youth afterwards. So all of these supports are there, and if you step back and said, as a parent, what would my role be, and went through all of those things, you'd say, check, yes, yes, yes. Those are all things that every young person should be offered. They should not be expected to bootstrap themselves out of this problem. So this is how this works. So how operationally, so you're a service provider and you want to do a Housing First for Youth program. What are some of the things you need to consider? Prioritization is an important issue. And so with the Housing First Pathways model, the prioritization focuses on chronicity and high acuity mental health and addictions. Now that should matter too for young people, right? So you want to support young people who have complex health and mental health needs, who want to support young people who've been homeless a long time, but I think you need to do more, right? Because understanding what are the risks for young people involve more than that. A young person who is in child protection and is going to age out in 6 months and has no income and no family connections, that person's at risk for being homeless. And we know it. So what if we supported them? A young woman who's couch surfing may be vulnerable to sexual exploitation and being trafficked, right? She's not yet sleeping on the streets or in a shelter, but she's very high risk. So we have to think about prioritization quite differently and understand what is the best intervention. What we can't do, and this is what we do in Canada often, is we'll say to young people, well, you haven't been homeless long enough to get Housing First supports, and you're not sick enough. So just wait a couple of years and then come back. This is honest to God true how we do it. That's insane. That's insane. You know, it's dehumanizing and damaging to people. So we need to do, you know, prioritize in a good way, and we need to use prioritization tools that are different than the usual ones that we get sold in Canada. The most popular tools are not strengths-based. They're just looking at what's wrong with you. They're not validated. There's no evidence. Well, there's evidence, but not that they work. There's evidence that they don't. They're actually not effective. So the YAP tool here is one that we're developing in Canada. That Melanie, you talked about this yesterday. It's a strengths-based tool, right? So it looks again at, you know, not risks but also assets. It involves the decision-making involves looking at what the young person says, but also what their person working with them says and understands, put that all together, and then creating a work plan. It's currently being validated, so we want things that have an evidence base. I thought you put your hand up. This is an important thing too, program outcomes. In designing the Housing First for Youth model, we build out the program outcomes based on the areas of service support. And this is, again, a shift in thinking, because in homelessness in Canada, even with Housing First, the only performance indicator that communities really care about is whether the person is housed or not. Housed, not. That's not good enough, because if we get a young person housed and they're in a dangerous situation and they're not healthy and they're not recovering, we're not really contributing to their long-term well-being. We have to focus on the whole of the young person and on their wellness and well-being. That's a different orientation than we're used to, right? So case management, here's some issues around case management that are important to understand. We need people who can work with young people, people who can work with families, people who are going to be very flexible. The relationship building is really important. You want to establish strong relationships between the caseworker and the adult. So a lot, you know, and the relationship piece can come through helping young people. It's like, you know, I need a screen for my window. Well, let's go to the hardware store, do that kind of thing. Working with them, checking in with them weekly, and helping them meet their needs and support them in good times and bad. Caseloads should be small. One of the challenges in Canada with using the adult model of Housing First is that the caseloads are often 20 or 25 per worker. That's not good enough for young people. We recommend between 7 and 10. Right? You want to be able to give that young person the attention they need. And so, and we find better outcomes for them. So yeah, here's a quote from Kim Kakakaway from Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary. She operates an Indigenous-led Housing First for Youth program. We need to consider the importance of family and natural supports. I think this should be true of all Housing First programs for all ages. But again, like building out those natural supports is going to be key, because those will outlast the program, right? And so we're learning lots about it. We know lots about how to do that work, but we're learning more about it. It's absolutely crucial. And then we need to embed Housing First for Youth within an integrated systems response. So Housing First for Youth, what we mean here is Housing First for Youth should not just be a program. We have to embed it in a response that says, what is the role of schools in helping young people? How do we engage the healthcare system? How do we engage the justice system? How do we engage the employment system? And work across all of these systems to provide the young people with the supports that they need. So I'm going to conclude now. Wow, right on time, according to my thinking. I'm going to, by talking about some innovation and adaptation of Housing First for Youth. So this model, by the way, which we developed in Canada, has taken off more quickly in Europe than it did in Canada, right? We did a lot of work in Europe, Melanie and I, and so people in Europe started adapting it in Ireland and Netherlands, many different countries. And so we learned a lot about, well, what do we need to do? One of the barriers in Canada to uptake of Housing First for Youth is that we don't have the evidence base that we do for the adult model. And so we've developed something in Canada called Making the Shift Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab. And so this is a new project, and what our goal is to invest in testing out models for young people that focus on prevention and sustainable exits from homelessness. And so youth homelessness is what we would call a wicked problem, right? So that means it's a complex issue for which we need to work with many different stakeholders to come up with good solutions. And so that's what the lab's going to allow us to do. As demonstration projects, we can, you know, work to take an intervention like Housing First for Youth, test it out, do research on how it works, and then build that evidence base. And so this is what we're doing with the Making the Shift project. We've organized that whole program around these research themes, so shifting to prevention and early intervention, and sustaining successful exits. Those are the core ones. And then we want to focus on health, well-being, and inclusion, enhancing outcomes for Indigenous youth, and leveraging data and technology. So that's the overall project, but let's get into the demonstration lab space here and talk about this. So we're doing demonstration projects on enhancing family and natural supports, Youth Reconnect, and Housing First for Youth. All of this demonstration lab project focuses or begins with clarity about the program design and prototyping, because a lot of program models don't have very clearly defined program designs. We're going to do research, or we are doing research and evaluation, looking both at developmental evaluation, like how do you roll out a program like this, but also what are the outcomes for young people. And that research piece is important, but only if we understand the relationship between research and practice. That the research should inform practice, what we learn from practice should inform the research, and it should continue that way so that we continually improve the program. So here we come down to the innovation. We've got 3 demonstration projects happening right now, and we're likely going to add 3 more within the year. So the Ottawa, it's Housing First for Youth. Toronto has a prevention focus, supporting young people exiting public systems. So we learned several years ago in the United States there was a Housing First for Youth program in Oakland called First Place, and it's supporting young people leaving care. And so what we're doing in Toronto here is implementing a Housing First model that works with child protection sector. So the sector workers know who is at risk, can tell you beforehand. So we work with them, provide, target the young people who are in greatest needs, get them into housing, and give them the supports they need. And so we're doing this in Toronto with an organization called Wood Green. The program's called Free to Be. And this is the kind of program we should have in every community. In Canada, 0.3% of all young people have been in care. But amongst young people who are homeless, it's 58%. So that's a big pipeline into homelessness. If we could do this well and support young people transitioning from care beyond going on their 18th birthday, congratulations, here's your clothes in a garbage bag, you have to leave, but in fact offer them options and support once they leave care, we'll be doing a much better job and reducing the risk that the young people become chronically homeless. The next one is about adapting Housing First for Indigenous youth, and this is one of the most exciting projects I think we've been involved in. So we know that, just as in Australia, our colonial history has involved domination and cultural extermination in many ways of Indigenous culture, right? And it involves deep racism, a history of racism, and ongoing experience of it. And so we need to think about so rather than say, here's Housing First for Youth model, this works just perfectly for Indigenous people, what if we took a different approach and worked with Indigenous people to adapt the model to make sense to them? And so that's what we're doing here in Hamilton, where the Ndayang project has been established. So it works again with young people who are Indigenous. It includes young people who are Indigenous who are exiting public systems like child protection, the justice system, et cetera. The goal of the program is that it be Indigenous-led, infused with Indigenous culture and in Indigenous ways of knowing. And it's important because the experiences of young people who are Indigenous has had a profound impact on their lives. And there's a need for recovery and healing. And so the Making the Shift project, Ndayung, helps us get there. And importantly, it's Indigenous-led, right? So we said, here's the framework. How would you like to think about it? And working with Hamilton Regional Indian Center. And they said, we'll love to do this. Like, we'll figure this out. It's going to be like, we'll take it from here. We'll work with you on this. And it's been fantastic. So, you know, and key to all this is the importance of cultural reconnection, because many Indigenous youth have grown up in situations where they're estranged from their cultural background and cultural identity. And how can we use that cultural identity as a point of recovery? So this means for many young people, reintroducing them to their Indigenous culture and background and the cultural practices. It means ensuring they have places and safe places to engage in learning about and practicing culture. It means support from elders and understanding the role of elders. It means exposing young people to the learnings of Indigenous people. It means bringing young people into ceremony. And it means healing. So all of these things are really key, right? This is at the core of it. And it also means for us, with Making the Shift, that we need to be brought into these, to learn more about Indigenous culture and embrace Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous practices. So one of the things we did with this project is we launched it through ceremony. And so all of our staff teams joined our Indigenous colleagues going into ceremony on the land. And so that was how you launch an Indigenous project in Canada, right? And so we went out and there was a morning ceremony. Here's a quote from one of the staff who was there. And so we went into ceremony to launch it and learned that that's like really important. We have to do that with everything we do. But it helped us build relationships and learn much about how to do things well for anyone. So we launched the program and did it in a very, with more ceremony. And the key things to know about this project, not only is the program design Indigenous-led, but so is the research. So we have Indigenous scholars who are leading the evaluation of the work. And so we're learning from them. And to say that it's Indigenous-led doesn't mean that there's a total rejection of Western ways of doing things. It means that there's a kind of a hybridity. We take Indigenous ways of knowing and bring it to bear on Western research methodologies. And we engage young people in all this work. So this is like young people doing a mapping, Indigenous youth mapping of like what do they think Ndayung and Housing First for You should be for them. And so the process has been really fantastic. One of the most amazing things is the innovation that's come out from this. So what Cheryl Green and Kim Kakaway from Calgary did is they said, okay, we've got those 5 core principles to Housing First. How do we indigenize that? How do we combine the 5 core principles with Indigenous ways of knowing? And so what they did, they took this, the medicine wheel model, the 7 grandfathers' teachings and 5 core principles of Housing First for Youth, to create a case management tool that's dynamic in that each ring you can twist. And so what they do, you can see the circles around the edge are not the core principles, but the areas of support. The inner circle is the core principles, And you can move it around and use that then to link Indigenous ways of knowing to how to do housing first for youth. And that's another example of hybridity, right? And so the main thing that we've been learning from this and thinking about the 7 grandfather teachings and this kind of thing is like, wow, this is the kind of thing that we could use for any young person, not just Indigenous youth. Like there's so much learning and knowledge there that should shine on all of us. And here's one of the interesting things we've learned from other examples of Indigenous led Housing First for Youth programs like in Calgary, is that Indigenous youth in that Housing First program, there are better outcomes for them than for non-Indigenous youth in just the Housing First, generalized Housing First for Youth program. So it suggests that there's something about Indigenous ways of knowing that works really well for young people, right? And so rather than like just frame Indigenous engagement as like supporting Indigenous people to provide services, it's like we need to like embrace the idea that Indigenous ways of knowing are very powerful for any human being, and how do we do that well? So that's an overview then of our Housing First for Youth program. And this is something that would be interesting in Australia to see how you might apply it here, because a lot of your conditions and circumstances are very similar. So, there we go.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks very much. Thanks for that. That wheel within wheels was actually a very good framework in thinking about just homeless youth in general as well as for Indigenous youth. Got any questions? And I'm going to kick off the first one for Stephen while you're thinking. We've already got some hands up early. Just let's go to the rights issue, Stephen, because I think here in Australia our delivery to young people and in that sense is a care or welfare or care model rather than a rights model.
Yes.
And I often think Australian welfare policy looks to Canada and looks to New Zealand as similar. Maybe it's because of our sort of Indigenous sort of heritage background as well as our systems of government. But I noticed that in New Zealand recently on a rights issue, they've now legislated that any young person, and picking up your thing of homeless young people in Canada, 58% or 56% have a care history. Here in Australia, it's 63% of homeless young people have a care history. New Zealand's now legislated an entitlement to a house, an entitlement to a carer for anyone 18 to 21. And it's further legislated that the New Zealand government have a mandatory obligation to provide a house and a carer to an adult, that is to 18 to 21. And what's interesting, rather than just what's going on in that example, is this rights approach seems to be able to cut through to get government's ambivalence into being obligated. And I'm wondering, is Canada moving along those lines in rights-based delivery to groups who are homeless, or other groups, rather than more of a care welfare model?
I think we are still stuck in the care model and also protection. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Away Home Canada did 4 years ago was work with Leilani Farr to develop something called Youth Rights Right Now. And like, how do we apply a human rights approach to working with young people? And how can young people realize their rights? And when you start to take a rights-based approach, it changes everything, right? So the whole idea of prioritization, it like becomes really problematic, that making you wait for 2 years to get access to your housing. Like, no young person should be made to wait in the state of homelessness, right? Or or rights to like income support. Like these, we should build out from that and ensure that, we don't have anything like the New Zealand legislation, but I'm now going to want to check that out. Like, that's a great way to approach it. Like, a rights-based approach would get us closer to thinking about what do we think any young person needs. Because when when we talk about youth homelessness, we're talking about, we create like this idea that they're somehow different than other youth, right? Like, you know, the 16-year-olds deserve housing unconditionally, or 18, or 21. Like, that should not be a question. They deserve right to education, right, and should be able to complete it. They deserve right to have enough food. They deserve right to safety. They deserve right to participation, right? And these are all enshrined in the International Covenant on the Rights of the Child. Like, it's there, and Canada's a signatory to it. So in Canada has declared housing as a right, but I don't think we figured out in Canada how to really apply that. But I think if we start by that and saying, you know, like, it's ridiculous that we expect young people to wait, or we create barriers to them to get the supports they need. Like, why would we ever do that to a young person? You know, like, why would I say to my 18-year-old, like, you get nothing now until you, you know, because there's a law that states that I don't have to support you. Like, we have to start from rights and work out from there, and then everything changes. And I don't think it's a big stretch to think that if we have obligations to support young people, that people won't step up and do it. But as long as we take these other approaches and think about stigma and waiting, and you know, we're going to continue to create real problems for young people rather than help them.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, a lady there, yep.
See, that's really an excellent question. And so we created our definition of youth homelessness to go 13 to 24 because we recognize that there's a big gap in Canada, right? So we did a national survey a couple of years ago and found that over 40% of all currently homeless young people had their first experience before they're 16. And of that group, they tended to have the most complex backgrounds. The history of housing precarity was there, history of bullying in school, like very complex backgrounds. And in Canada, we have kind of avoided doing anything for them. You're not eligible for homelessness supports until you're 16. There's nothing for them. And so by saying we need to focus on that group of young people, it can change everything. And that's why, like, reconnect programs can be really helpful, like early intervention, get into the schools, Geelong Project, that kind of thing, and support young people. But it raises the question around housing. And so there are legal constraints around housing in Canada. In some jurisdictions, landlords cannot insure property if the leaseholder is under 18. I'm not saying that a 13 or 14-year-old should be in scattered site housing, right? But we need to be thinking, like, and if you had this Housing First for Youth framework and core principles guiding it, you would figure out, like, work with a young person and their family. Can we help? Is there, like, possibility for supporting that family? If that's not going to work, what will work? But what should not work is we're going to send you to a homeless shelter, right? Like, that should be right. But don't get one. No. Don't get one. And so it's a really good question. So there should be solutions to that, all of these problems, right? Like, but young people who are, under 16, a lot of I mentioned the reconnect work you do, like keeping young people in place in their community so they're still engaged to their friends, their school, if they're involved in, sports or music or whatever, building out those kind of supports in their community. Not stigmatizing them. Like, there's work to do there that's very specialized, and it's not necessarily work that the homelessness sector should be doing, right? It's like we have to think about it differently. And it's also not a case of, like, just tossing them over to child protection, because it may not be a child protection issue, right? And in Canada, child protection is designed basically for children, not for teenagers. And so we need people who have expertise working with young people and their developmental needs to provide the supports. But if we did that well, man, we would change lives. You know, it'd be better for young people, it'd be better for their families, better for their communities.
Okay. Thanks. Vicky. And then you.
Just a question. So in terms of supports with no time limits, what about aging out of the system? So sort of hit that 25 age barrier. I presume there's a practical time.
Well, this is something we work on, right? And so we have the notion of graduation. And what happens is that young people will eventually say, just like my kids, you know, I'm 20, I'm going to move out now. And so it's like, okay, I'm in a Housing First for Youth program, I'm going to move out now. Like, you'll have to think about, like, well, what are the support needs? Are they still going to need some kind of income support, or are they okay? But if in those kind of situations, you also want to create pathways back. If it's like, things didn't turn out so well, I thought I could make it, I need more support. So you know, the cutoff of like 24 or whatever, like that's there, but they may need continued support, and so like that's another thing, but it would be more on the adult system side, right?
Thinking about graduation pathways and then handoff points.
Handoff points, just in the same way through all of that, right? So a young person, if they have mental health supports in Canada, we divide it between like under 18 and over 18. The systems are very different, and young people often trip over that unless they get that handoff and that support. So it's working through those kind of details.
Okay, lady up the back there, is that right? Yep.
Right. Absolutely, and there's overlap between the two, but so I'll try to go through both of them. So with young parents, that's an area where we're trying to, actually the Ottawa site that we mentioned, this is coming up a lot. So one of the things that young people, when they get into a Housing First program, will identify is that, you know, like I'm 18 or I'm 20, but I have a child and I don't have the child with me. And it can get complicated because child protection in Ontario has rules that you can't be reunited with your child unless you have minimum 2 bedrooms, right? And so they create like these barriers. Now in a Housing First program, they might have rules that you can only get a 1-bedroom place. And so there are solutions to all of these things, but it requires like thinking very differently about it. And what we've seen from both adult and youth approaches to Housing First is that reconnection with a child can be make a huge difference in a person's life. Because they will have had all these factors that led them to homelessness, but then they have the trauma of losing their child. And so that should be a priority, but it requires then different supports. Right? Like, well, how are we going to help you around parenting? How are we going to make sure you have income, daycare or whatever? So that's really important. The LGBTQ2S issue is really important as well, because we know in Canada that homophobia and transphobia are drivers of youth homelessness, right? So young people experience rejection either in their family or in their school or their community, and it's not safe to stay. So how do we think then about enhancing family and natural supports for LGBTQ2S youth? And we say 2S in Canada, that means two-spirited, because that's the Indigenous way of thinking about non-straight gender and sexual orientation. And so that may mean, okay, how do we approach enhancing family and natural supports? What are the natural supports? How do we support engagement in community? Like, who are the community? What's the community you want to be part of? And so to do that work well, we have to be mindful of that. that there's multiple layers of exclusion there, right? And so the intersectionality piece comes in as well. So these are all things that are actually on the minds in working with LGBTQ youth, working with young people who are homeless, and in a Housing First for Youth model, that would be key, right? So again, if young people are the drivers of their own bus, we have to make sure our supports attend to that, and we have to make sure, in terms of discrimination, that we don't, re-traumatize people through supports that are homophobic and transphobic, right? And so both of those are very interesting. I'd say the issue of supporting young families is a frontier area for us, but it's one that we're actually, is very much on our radar about how to do that work well. So thanks for raising that.
Any other questions? One more there, and then I'll get to you, sir.
Hi, Steve. I'm Zoe Groban from the Department of Health and Human Services. I've been working on reform in terms of young people moving care, and obviously ending up in our homelessness system. So we've been doing a bunch of things in our area, some of which have been going well, some not so well. But I suppose one of my major challenges, I've come from the homelessness sector into the department, background in homelessness, is trying to get the right support for child protection staff themselves and to some degree living care staff actually talking to each other and doing that planning earlier. So we did a big audit of all the kids in out of home care in my region, which is Hugh Orland, which is kind of a biggish metro area. And then we applied a housing triage so we could figure out who was at risk. And then we've been working through plans for those children, for those young people, so we've brought in homelessness providers to help us do that internally. And it's been a really good process. We've so far only had one person in the last 6 months leave in an unplanned way, and we've been able to follow them up. So it's sort of kind of working, I hope. But I suppose the thing I've struggled with is that child protection staff, at least in my area, are often young, they're predominantly women, it's often maybe their first job out of university, and there is a lot of critique that comes their way, and so they find that quite demoralising and difficult. And for me to try and find ways for us to work more collaboratively has been quite a challenge. So I'm quite interested to know what sort of access to training around housing and homelessness do child protection staff get in Canada, because it seems to be pretty minimal, if not absolutely nothing here. And what sort of advice do you have? I noticed there's a program that you talked about, that project, that looks quite similar to the kind of things we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a really, it's a set of challenges that are front of mind to us. And we've done, with Away Home Canada, a lot of work, trying to work with child protection systems. And Canada is complicated because it's a provincial and territorial responsibility, so it looks different in every place. 5 years ago, there was very little interest from the child protection side in this issue. It was kind of like, if young people are transitioned from care, it's not our responsibility anymore. And we've seen an evolution in that regard that's been very positive. But the way to approach it, and we've heard this from a deputy minister who's in charge of child protection in Ontario, like when we did this policy brief on supporting young people transitioning from care, she goes, "Thank you for not telling us what a horrible job we're doing." Don't, help us out. But there are, with the...
they are working with an unreasonable rule, aren't they, Stephen?
Yeah.
The unreasonable rule is care cannot continue
That's right.
to 18. So it's not really an issue of training. Is it an issue of changing the rule?
Well, it's both. One is that whole cutoff at 18 made sense in 1950, when you could quit school and leave home and work in a factory and rent a house, and it doesn't make sense now, right? In Canada, the percentage of young people between 20 and 29, so not teenagers, but young adults who live with their parents, is over 40%. And those who do live independently, 70% get income from the family. So young people leaving care, we have to change the system. and have like some kind of aftercare. It doesn't, the young person may want to stay with a foster parent, but they may want alternatives. The support should be tied to the individual, not to the program. So we do absolutely have to transform care, and that's a long-term battle, and it gets caught up in the usual, you know, limitations like government. Well, we could do that, but it'll cost money, as if doing nothing doesn't cost money. But there's also the learning, the cultural thing, and through the Free to Be project, we found some interesting things that we didn't expect. And that, so we had this program that said, we're going to work with you in child protection when you do the planning. We'll be there to help young people get housing and supports they need. And it's been very slow trust building because the care workers operate from a perspective of protection and not necessarily youth empowerment. And so they've been reluctant to make referrals to a program that will basically guarantee housing and supports. And so I would say that if I could generalize, and Melanie or Tabs, you might want to comment on this, but I'd say that there's very little training. It would differ jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And the other challenge around child protection in Canada is even like the creating plans and goal setting with young people. There's not necessarily training on how to do that. And most legislation, because it's provincial legislation, will say that child protection workers should do planning, but it's not a requirement.
We might,
and so you get then like,
so
it's optional, and then that's the worst thing.
Yeah, we're just running quickly out of time, but I did promise this gentleman a question and a brief answer from you, Stephen.
All right.
So quickly, just to put my question in the context. So when I was 16, I was in transitional housing. It wasn't very new at that time. I was in child safety. So one of the things was is that I was very alone. So
Yes.
they pretty much put me in there and gave me no support. They were just like, if I needed a food voucher now and again, you know. And so what ended up happening? I've actually never had a party or birthday party in my life until this year.
No.
So when I was 16, I wanted to have friends and things. I wanted to belong to something. And so I met some friends that I had at that moment, and they knew people that knew other people, and then they were like, okay, we'll throw a party at your place. And like, I was given a 3-bedroom like house when I was 16. So like it was, and the rent was a bit high for what I could afford. And yeah, so after that party happened, I got kicked out, and what happened is that because there was nowhere else to go, they had to put me back with the abusive family that they took me from years prior. So and from that, you know, more things happened. Like my private business became everyone's business, and then yeah, from there I moved to Melbourne. So my question is like, how will you help the people who do break these sort of rules? How will you support them into staying in this
So thank you for thank you for sharing your story, right? And your story tells us a lot of things about where a good intervention could have supported you. So with the Housing First for Youth model, that housing support piece is really key, right? So if you didn't have housing support, what a good model of housing support would do would be that you have a housing worker alongside the case manager. And so they would be dealing with the landlord as well. And so you had a party and the landlord is upset and there might be damage or whatever. You would have an ally or an advocate to negotiate with the landlord, right? And say, you know, can we come up with a solution to this? You know, to talk with you, like, because I'm pretty sure you learned something from that, right? Right? And so that's the key thing is like for any young person growing up, like who doesn't make mistakes? Yeah. I'll tell you this, just so you know what's coming. I make mistakes all the time, right? Like that's part of life. But rather than have like these harsh consequences that are negative, like turn them into learning moments, work with the landlord, whose interest, by the way, is to keep tenants, right? Because you don't have the gap time. So do that kind of support and build that kind of support. The idea of just like, you know, we say, you know, getting someone housed and throw the keys through the mail slot and run away, that's not helpful, right? Like you should have been supported on that, right? And there are ways of doing it, and with, you know, the Housing First for Youth programs, that's what they will do. Because young people will get evicted, right? Or will be faced with eviction, and it can be avoided, or what would happen in a Housing First for Youth program, if you did get evicted, it'd be like, okay, we're going to get you into another place. And that's going to be our job, is to get you into another place, and you would be learning from that, and it wouldn't be punitive, it wouldn't be like you screwed up or you're a bad person. It'd be like, you know, these things happen, you know, but like you can't have a big party like that, and you would know the next time not to do that.
Well,
right?
we might leave it there because we've got to pull up, but it's a very interesting discussion about youth culture and homelessness and housing and the right to have a party. So good on you, mate, for trial and testing the system. Pity it ended up badly for you. I want to thank Stephen Gaetz for coming along and presenting. Thanks very much, everyone, for attending this very interesting session. By the way, if you're interested in changing the rule, not living with an unreasonable rule, go to homestretch.org.au, sign the pledge, tell this government 10% of extended care is bullshit. The Premier's not planning to kick his 3 kids out at 18, nor should we for our state kids. Sign the pledge, folks, and get on board and bring this reform into Victoria. Thanks very much.